I first want to say a big thank you to Decolonise Architecture for inviting me to be in conversation with Leslie. And yeah, I want to start with a quote by June Jordan, who says, "I would wish us to indicate the determining relationship between architectonic reality and physical well-being. I hope that we may implicitly instruct the reader in the comprehensive impact of everywhere, of any place. This requires development of an idea of theory of place in terms of human beings, of space designed as the volumetric expression of successful existence between earth and sky, of space cherishing as it amplifies the experience of being alive, the capability of endless beginnings and the entrusted liberty of motion, of particular space that is open receptive and communicant, yet sheltering particular life," end quote. When I think about what it means to kind of theorize the connection between space, place, and freedom, I think about these words from June Jordan. I think she saw the direct link between the design of our world and the way that we inhabit it. And in her work with Buckminster Fuller, trying to redesign public housing in Harlem after the murder of a Black teenager called James Powell in 1964, she noted how the streets mapped out life expectancy, how something as simple as the design of windows and stairwells limited what could be seen, what could be known, what could be interacted with. She wished space to mean the volumetric expression of successful existence. That requires an understanding of place that means more than just where we are situated. It requires us to understand place as a location of infinite possibility, as the location of what could be. I think it's true that between earth and sky, there exists potential for something else, something more, something other, something that is the opposite of the here and now. And every day, that possibility, I think, is crushed and kind of ground to dust by machineries of exploitation. And let's be specific about what those machineries are. To name a few of those components, that is capitalism, precarious work, the family, racism, gender violence, poverty, neoliberal individualism. I think I'm trying to say that the place that we live and the thing that we call shelter does many things to our understanding of what we might be able to have and demand for ourselves. We don't often think that a street or a house can determine how we will live, but I think it does. Every person who is poor knows that food is much more than food. A house with poor insulation, no heating, a house that is physically inaccessible, that has little access to green space with 3 or 4 to a room is akin to a kind of slow suffocation. And living as we do on top of one another with no room to stretch our feet or for our children to play, and being so isolated, not knowing our next door neighbors, not knowing who we could depend on in an emergency is a political question. I think that design is more than just an architectural component in the traditional sense. It's more than just the arrangement of the physical objects that we use to make something. It's also about the discourses we use to build and give meaning to the world around us, especially if we're thinking about, the building of a feminist city. Jordan knew this. If you changed how people lived materially, you could also change their understanding of themselves, their relations with others, and kind of break the inertia that makes them think that the way that we live now is anything other than miserable and alienated and unlivable. By that, I mean, the way that we talk about this life and living, the language that we use builds a kind of structure that obscures the horizon. That is a kind of design, right? So when we say something like housing for all, when we make that political demand and the government responds with something like, the homeless are being temporarily housed in hotels to avoid the spread of the virus, they're building a linguistic structure that defines the realm of the possible, that implicitly tells us to demand less, to want less, to expect that the kind of radical transformation that we hope for is impossible. Like a poorly designed building, that linguistic structure affects how we think, how we breathe, move, and act. And this linguistic design is the preservation of a system of organization that places capital before all else and places us in danger. It ties our hands and feet together. So if we follow Jordan, everywhere and every place has a comprehensive impact. Everything we do and say that brings place and space into existence, that defines its contours, that explicitly makes clear who can and cannot enter, also has an impact. I think to get free, we not only have to break the kind of linguistic loop, but we have to come up with an expansive conception of design. We have to redesign the world using the tools at our disposal. And I think of feminism and the demands that it facilitates as one such tool. I think of feminism as a kind of political framework and methodology that we can use to think about our freedom and the freedom of others. In her work, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Saidiya Hartman theorizes the idea of the chorus. And she says, quote, "The chorus is a vehicle for another kind of story, not of great man or tragic hero, but one where all modalities play a part, where the headless group insights change, where mutual aid provides the resource for collective action. The chorus propels transformation. It is an incubator of possibility, an assembly sustaining dreams of the otherwise." End quote. I think of radical feminism as a kind of chorus, leaderless, stateless, and incremental. It is sustained by the lifeblood of collective action. So no laws or decrees or kind of big name theorists save us. Historically and in the contemporary moment, we save each other and our communities. And feminism responds to the urgency of the moment and holds at its core the idea that existing structures, physical, linguistic, affective, must be abolished. So to end, when I say that feminism might help us to respond to the moment, I mean things like Focus E15, who are a feminist group demanding housing. I mean how they have demonstrated that when the council tells us something like there is no available housing for single mothers, we simply take it. We occupy what we know is there. We start living there with our children, and when we do, we change the very meaning of space. We demand social housing, knowing that this is only the beginning of the demands that we will make. We change the architectural design of a space, I think, when we inhabit it against the express wishes of the authorities, of the bureaucrats, of the police, of the state. And that for me is a theory of place, a meaningful use of space that, has broken that linguistic frame that tells us that this kind of land, these spaces belong to anyone but us. When we look to Brazil and see Black women's continued organizing against land dispossession and gentrification in the Gambo de Barro neighborhood, we also have, I think, another example of what it means to understand shelter as more than simply a place that one lays their head to rest. So I'll end there. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for that. And over to Leslie.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. And in keeping with Irit's opening statement, I'll just acknowledge the settler colonial context that I join you from today in what is currently known as Sackville, New Brunswick, Canada, but is the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people with whom we share ongoing treaties of peace and friendship. And I hope to always in my work acknowledge that this relationship is an important foundational element of everything that I do and of any idea of the feminist city. So I'll just say that I'm always really, I've been kind of surprised and thrilled when people in architecture and planning type professions have wanted to speak to me over the past year. And I'm grateful because those conversations have really pushed me to try to be a bit clearer about things like what are the physical and design elements of a feminist city? Because I think in the book, I was a little bit hesitant to do that, maybe because I'm not an architect or a designer, but in part, why I wrote the book was to find a way for myself to kind of contribute to a broader set of conversations about feminism and power and inequality. And I thought, well, as a geographer, I can try to bring kind of the spatial element to that. And just as Lola was explaining so nicely, the idea that our cities, our spaces, our buildings around us, they are active participants in social relations. They're not just a container or a stage where power and interpersonal relationships play out or where systems kind of touch down. They are actually part of those very structures and systems. And I see my work as drawing on a very long tradition of women and feminists and other marginalized people who have understood this in a very real way and understood it from the perspective of everyday life. the perspective of embodiment and from the perspective of what it means to get free. So even thinking back to, the 19th century, early sort of first wave feminists understood that the structure of the home was in part responsible for women's exploitation in the home and was a limiting factor that would prevent them from taking up public roles in, education and politics and professions and going out into public space. So there's a long tradition of this kind of thinking, and yet it does seem that we kind of constantly need to reiterate this, in part because our cities and our homes and so on very easily, I think, come to be taken for granted. It's sort of the water that we swim in, right? We don't always notice the built environment in the same way that we might notice other ways that power is operating around us. And of course, I wrote this book now a couple of years ago. It came out in Canada in late 2019, so well before, not well, but shortly before the pandemic kind of shifted the conversation in a way that I think has opened some space for starting to question what we've taken for granted about our environment, as people have had to interact with cities, homes, workspaces, public transportation, public spaces, and so on in very different ways that have made many people kind of more attentive to things that they might not have been so attentive to before. And it's also provided a moment where, as we think about, okay, like what next, right? What are we going to do with all of these things that we've noticed and all of these problems that, of course, predate the pandemic, but were sort of sharpened in the pandemic moment. So it's kind of a moment where we can have some of those conversations. And one of the things that I hope that some people have noticed is the fact that some of these very, the mundane spaces of things like the home and so on are also spaces of violence and exploitation, right? So we've, early on in the pandemic, has sort of taken for grantedness that home would be a safe space, that everybody has a home, that the home can function in all of these different ways to provide schooling for children and monitoring each other's health and wellness as a place of work and as a place of relationships and domesticity. And I think many people have found that no, the home doesn't function that way. And of course, it's a moment where the violence of domestic abuse in the home has once again been highlighted, that the home is very much not a safe space for many women and children in particular. And of course, that the home is an ongoing site of exploitative extraction of labor that, still predominantly falls on the shoulders of women. So, one of the things that I want to kind of think about as we move to a post-COVID world is like, how can we, like radically reimagine the home? How can we kind of blow up this single family home structure that I think is so problematic, and yet something that we just take for granted so much so that we rarely question it at all. We also, I think, if we're thinking about issues like care work, we need to consider how are we going to change the exploitative dynamics that characterize so much of care work, both inside the home and outside of the home, where it's done by very undervalued, stigmatized, and underpaid labor by women and racialized people. How are we going to change how we organize this, and what role can cities play in that? So how can we imagine and build, not just imagine, but build as well, a city that really prioritizes care work? Right now, I think in a lot of architecture and design, everything from, where you're going to put a toilet to where you're going to put a bench, like these things are, if not afterthoughts, they're kind of like well, this is just the code and we have to follow this. We have to put a bathroom here and has to have this much, square meters, blah, blah, blah. It's not really considered as like the focal point of design to think about where are people going to rest? How are people going to eat? How is care work potentially going to be done in this space? We kind of assume that the vast majority of that work will happen in the home, and, we only need to have like a minimal provision for care to happen in both outdoor and indoor public spaces. But I would really like us to, again, kind of blow that assumption up and think about, instead of prioritizing cars, for example, in our public spaces, or this thing that we call the economy, what if we acknowledge our sort of radical interdependence on one another in terms of care, and recognize that this thing that we call the economy doesn't exist without that care work, and we kind of build that in first. So again, as someone who's not an architect and designer, I've kind of had to push myself to think about like, what would that look like? And I'm starting to come up with some ideas, but I think, people in your professions are very well positioned to use your imagination and your design skills and your, ways of thinking about space to start somewhere different, right? When you're thinking about the spaces that you might create. So I'll pause there so that we can move on to a conversation, but thank you for letting me share those remarks.
Great, thank you so much. And already I think there's kind of just so much to delve into there. And I was really excited by it. I don't know if either of you already have questions for each other, or if you kind of would like me to start, but maybe Lola, you might have some responses.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Leslie. I was thinking, as you were talking, not only about the pandemic, but the summer that we've seen, and particularly in your book when you talk about kind of protest and how protest shapes and changes space, and what you've learned, as a scholar in organizing spaces, in spaces where protest happens. So I've been thinking about, and I guess this is a very open-ended question, but the connection between resistance and space, and how resistance changes space, and how, so often the role of the state and the police is to kind of isolate people and to surveil people and to make them aware of the space that they occupy, right? All in an effort to kind of get people inside. I'm thinking about how police, kettle organizers. I'm thinking about the ways that people are always encouraged to disperse, to go home. And what I see, having, been to organizing spaces, having been involved in kind of organizing, is the kind of radical potential of loitering, of being in the street. There's something not only kind of, there's something queer about it, I think, like making the private public, but also in that disobedience, what is your understanding of how that changes our relation to space, or even changes space itself, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I think that with the pandemic, people have found a kind of, maybe more people than usual have kind of noticed one of those fundamental contradictions of being like told to go out and socialize outside in urban public spaces, and even, kind of urban green spaces or urban adjacent green spaces, and have found that they're not very amenable to those activities, that we have hollowed out our cities of so much of both the physical infrastructure and the kind of social norms of how we might gather in ways that are not seen as threatening or problematic, or that even are simply facilitated by like having a bench or having a public restroom nearby, that in order to kind of protect our cities from threats of homelessness, just loitering youth, crime, a kind of amorphous idea of crime, and of course terrorism, so we have these hardened environments that are not very like human or humane. And so, yes, kind of thinking about, if we want to imagine a city that brings care work into the public and becomes more collectivized, we do have to radically shift our thinking about what public space can be used for, and kind of remove from our norms and our kind of internalized surveillance and external surveillance, but our internalized ideas of like what's okay in public space and what's not, and a fear of disorder and so on that has been so like inculcated in us for so long. So yeah, I think it's quite incompatible with really the direction that cities have been going for so long.
Yeah, I think also it means maybe in these liberated futures that we're thinking about, or these ways that we're imagining the future unfolding, it also means rethinking the idea of what the city is and what constitutes a city. Because I think especially when we talk about urban space, we have a very specific idea of what that looks like and what that is. And when I feel like there's also an imperative not to get kind of trapped by the language of the city, right? To kind of in ourselves open that out, right? So that we have some sense of like what it might mean to reshape our relationship to the outside, and not necessarily call that a city, or not go looking for planning permission, or not, you know, automatically mean that that has to do with some kind of building or something like that. I don't know what your kind of thoughts are, because I think of, when I think about the future, when I think about the potential that feminism offers us, it's a future that really can't be pinned down. It's something, it operates in that language of the unknown. And I think lots of times people are very scared of what they don't know, or scared of what has not come yet. And so there's always this tendency to say, well, let's take every already existing structure and just make it feminist by, you know, being attentive to all of the ways it could be better. But yeah, I think the bursting open is quite important as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this reminds me of sort of a question that I jotted down for you, in that, you know, in so many of the, like, you know, talks and events that I've done, people will often ask, like, is there a feminist city? Like, what's the best example of this city? Or give me, you know, all of these concrete examples. And I understand the desire to have those things, but I also feel very like resistant sometimes to it. I like, well, if there was a feminist city, I think I would like live there already, hopefully. Um, but yeah, I mean, I like you, I don't want to kind of close that down too soon and say, this is the example, this is the prototype, this is exactly how you do it, because I think there's so much that we haven't even imagined yet, or haven't kind of really fleshed out, if you will, or things that we're still like hanging on to, whether it is like the idea of the single family home or the nuclear family, and like, how are we going to, you know, push through those structures to think about, if we kind of explode those, how does that explode some of the spaces around us? So I was curious if you find, you know, since you've been talking about your book and you're very, you know, you kind of say like the state is not going to save us, like we're not looking to the state for the solution. Do people still ask you like, but what's a good example of the state doing things right?
I think I get that a lot, or people are anxious about what one's relationship to the state or one's relationship to institutions should be whilst they still exist, right? And I always say that, you know, in response to that, the answer is strategic, right? You get from institutions what is necessary, what is necessary to kind of redistribute. You use law and policy in ways that lessen people's proximity to violence, but you don't hinge your political projects on that point, right? And I think, yeah, it has a lot to do with how existing structures to imagine what could be possible for our relation. And I feel like when I think of when the phrase kind of feminist city unfolds, all I think about is collectivity. I think of like a being that's born from relation to one another, and that'll look, you know, so depending on geographical context, depending on who we are, who we're with. But I also see in pockets of resistance, like in what's happening in Palestine right now, in Black Lives Matter riots, chaos, I see the possibility of that kind of relation again, the idea of like the autonomous zone. That to me is like of a specific structure against the structures that exist currently. And that's where I think architectural possibility, you know, exists, because I feel, I don't know, I'm always interested in the work that architects do, because like you have so much power to actually determine people's relationship to space, but you're so beholden to organizations based on capital, right? So you build corporate offices, or you build to a spec that has already been defined to you by the structure of capital. And if we took that away from people, right, or if we overcame it, if we abolished it, what then is the possibility for architects to give us skills in order to be able to realize, you know, just a fraction of what it's possible to imagine. I wondered also about like what your thoughts on kind of psychogeography are as a geographer of urban space, and the importance of that, I guess, to people who live in urban space.
Yeah. my thoughts are that we probably need to pay a lot more attention to it. In some ways, like you were talking before about kind of, how language and systems and discourse kind of close things down, shut things down. In some ways, so much of planning does that too, even unintentionally, but often intentionally. It's kind of predetermining what can be done in a space, right? It's kind of deciding, usually from top down, maybe with a little consultation about what a space is going to be used for. But without often a lot of attention to the more mundane experience of space, the affective realm, the mundane embodied realm of like needing to go to the bathroom or needing to sit down or like being too hot in the sun and all these sorts of things that are just very like micro experiential things, but that do shape the texture of people's lives in very real ways. And yet I think so much of planning, it's a rational, technical, objective. You don't want to deal with like the messiness of people, of bodies, the like irrationality of sort of emotion. Like people are like, well, why don't people cross the street in this place that we've told them to cross the street? They perpetually cross in this other way, and it's just frustrating and it ruins the flow of traffic and it's unsafe. And it's like, well, people probably have a reason, like maybe on the other side of the street is like the most popular place to go, or that's where the park is, or that's where the school is, or whatever. So not paying attention to how people really use space over time, I think leads to this situation too, where then you kind of have to go back and try to retrofit things, which is also like inefficient and not great from a planning or architectural perspective. Yeah. Lola, I was wondering, maybe this is kind of like a pick your brain question. So often we're talking about like women's safety in the cities as a key kind of issue for the feminist city. And like you, I agree that policing is absolutely not the answer to women's safety in cities. And but at the same time, I'm often asked, well, you talk about in your book how like women's fear and the experience of even just street harassment is a real impact that shapes how women move through the city, the choices that they make, how they can engage in the city. So what do we do about street harassment if we're not going to criminalize it? What are our alternatives? And I have like a few ideas, but I admit this is like a pernicious problem. So do you get this question? How do you respond to it?
Yeah. So it reminds me of what I enjoyed so much about your book, which was the kind of personal anecdotes, your personal relationship to specific spaces. And I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of like location. But to actually, I feel like you say that when you say something like, the problem of street harassment does not go away when we criminalize it. All we're doing is opening up space for the police and the state to enter into our lives even more and to criminalize already, marginalized communities, whatever. We're doing this statement. I think that's exactly people kind of hone in on the gap. They say, what do we do? And when that kind of comes up, I think about the kind of histories of women resisting on the street that have nothing to do with the state and the police, even as something as simple as walking together, walking in a group, doing things that make us feel safe in the street, right? So that even if we experience harassment, even if we experience violence, we're not alone in that experience. I feel like that is one of the like coming back to this point of like connectivity and relation, that's something that's so important to processing experiences of violence. But I also think that things like street harassment might be, from an abolitionist perspective, dealt with and addressed by addressing the root causes of a masculinity that is premised on aggressive domination and the subordination of specific bodies or the claim to ownership of specific bodies. And that means rethinking from the very basic tenets, socialization, the ways that we think about gender, and allowing for a more expansive and freeing understandings of gender that don't reconstitute the violence that we experience, right? And I feel like that's for some people a very abstract answer, but it's also one that is the only way that we might think of ending this problem, because putting the harasser in jail means that, like, doesn't mean that the person won't harass anymore. It subjects them to another kind of violence that we ourselves as feminists say that we're against. And I feel like that there is a specific way that particularly white women's concerns about safety in the street, we've seen historically, have been mobilized as the kind of precursor to even more violence, right, for those of us. And so if we're to take seriously that in this project of building, you know, a feminist city, a feminist world, a liberated future, that includes all, we have to be ready for the complications that present themselves when one person says, I feel safe, please make me feel safe, and another person says, the don't make me feel safe for various reasons, right? And that means, that means getting used to complicated questions and answers specific around that idea of safety. Everybody, I feel like every person who's read as a woman understands the fundamental feeling of feeling unsafe when we go out on the street. But I'm more interested in collective and informal ways to have one another. That's been networks, that's through, you know, getting like, have you gotten home safe, etc. All of these methods I think are if albeit small.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it is important, I think, as you're suggesting, to not just see the tactics that women employ as, like, I don't know, evidence of our victimization or oppression, but also as evidence of, like, our resistance and our creativity and our survival strategies and our strength and courage and those things as well. As frustrating as it can be to sometimes feel like, well, why do I, you know, need to do these things, but also to see, oh no, this is what people do. Although somebody did say, well, maybe we were talking about, like, how in some ways the advice to women and living in the city is, like, the same as it was 150 years ago, like, dress modestly, have a chaperone, blah blah blah. And someone was like, well, yeah, and but at least back then women had hat pins and they could, you know, jab their harassers with hat pins. So maybe we need to, I mean, return to the hat pin as well.
Women chase down their harassers now, they beat them up. There's yeah, I feel like I really agree with the point of actually reinscribing agency to ourselves on the street by thinking and rethinking the ways that we treat each other, not as agencies, not as things are, like, forced to do, but as ways that we recognize that our safety is a responsibility that each of us carry for each other, and that we have a specific duty not to involve the state or the police as much as we can in the ways that we seek to be with one another in kind of public. I think it draws back to this idea that, like, most women experience street harassment, they don't go to the police, they just experience the harassment and then internalize it and never speak about it again. And what that possibility of, like, critical consciousness raising together, phoning someone, talking through our experiences, enables us to better place ourselves in the world, to understand the structures that oppress lives, go about ending them seriously, instead of us as for whom violence is done onto.
Lola, I'm really sorry to interrupt. It just seems that your internet connection is a bit unstable. Is there any chance you could perhaps turn off the video and maybe the audio would come through more smoothly?
Is that better?
It might be the same.
Well, you
can try it. We can try for a while.
I think it's been kind of, I found that it's clear enough.
Okay. I'll keep my camera off just to somehow make it better.
Great. I actually might use this opportunity to say, I've got a question written down and then to open it up to the floor, if that works for the panelists.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks so much for everything in the conversation so far. I kind of was just thinking about, Lola mentioned this idea of the architecture of the possibility, and that really stuck with me in reference to Lola's other mention of Saidiya Hartman and the idea of the wayward, and kind of connecting both of your two works. I remember, Leslie, you wrote a bit about kind of the conversations and the space of the bedroom floor and how that's both like a restrictive space and kind of also this place for kinship and care. And I'm thinking also about the protests and how it takes up space, and thinking about the Grenfell protests, for instance, which are these silent walks through the street, which really stills the city. And I was wondering if these two kind of moments could be combined to have a way to think about the temporary, and whether the temporary, these kind of small moments, are a way to build this architecture of the possibility. And I was wondering if either of you could speak to this notion of the temporary as maybe one of the building blocks kind of towards our sort of idealized and imagined and otherwise feminist city. I don't know who wants to go first.
Well, certainly, you know, I think both Lola and I talk about in our books the idea that, you know, people are already doing like the work, right? Just in ways that are not like necessarily legitimized or kind of institutionalized in some way. Like it's already happening, and that's kind of like how I end Feminist City, is like, just go and look for it if you want to find the feminist people doing the work already, right? You will find communities organizing for the things that they need. You'll find, you know, all of these things, you'll find them. So it's kind of already there. So I think from a design perspective, maybe when we think about temporary, I want to think about like flexibility, you know, in particular, like the home is such an inflexible space in many ways. We haven't really made use of maybe technologies that would allow us to have like flexible design in homes to account for different like changes in the family over time, but also different kinds of family configurations, and yeah, a recognition that our sort of best laid designs, I mean, this is the tension of the built environment, is that by the time it's built, it might be out of date, right, for the social realities that it's meant to be addressing. So some sense of like, you know, what can be temporary or what can be flexible might be useful going forward.
I hope my internet is better. I apologize if it isn't. But yeah, I think this is a really great question. And when I think of the temporary, I think of kind of fragmentation and how the world as we know it now, like architecturally is, well, in some places very much based on this idea of order, of the functioning of the city, right? That like there should be places for people to live, there should be places where people go and eat, there should be places where people etc. And I feel like what introducing this kind of concept of the temporary does is introduce a chaos into our understanding of like how we might be able to structure human life. And I think that that's scary for lots of reasons, but I also think it undoes this kind of commitment to linearity that underpins so much of the way that we live now, our understandings of history, our understandings of our own bodies in relation to others, our understandings of the past, the present and the future. And I feel like when we begin to think in fragmentary ways, when we see how temporary political movements or demands or autonomous zones or silent walks, whatever, how those all of those things kind of map together, or all of those things are working in tandem, even if they seem unconnected, then I feel like we have another kind of or a route in thinking about architecture possibility. We have another route into thinking about what we organize being with each other that aren't based around this, like as Leslie said before, this kind of strict understanding of like how how a city is mapped out or how a city is planned, so I think we have to, there's lots in this question requires us to give up a lot of things that I think people are still very to in terms of how they understand where they live and where their friends live, and how they get to work, how they get to school. And I think the pandemic has enabled that space, amidst like death and destruction and callous abandonment by this, has opened up a space for rethinking things like work, rethinking things like the home, and who what work constitutes the worker, what labor goes into making work possible. I feel like those are the kind of the starting steps, in that the social reproductionists are always right about these things. Like those are the building blocks to an architectural principle that is based on the temporary, the fragmentary, the riot, the chaos, the thing that can't be and the thing that has to be unsettled.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And I really appreciate both of your responses to that. I think that was, yeah, really insightful. Thank you so much. I'm going to kind of take this opportunity to open up to the floor. We've already got one question coming through, and hopefully we'll have some more. So if anyone is comfortable to send a question, please do, either to the chat or the Q&A. The first question that's come through, I'm not familiar with the design that's mentioned, so I apologize if I pronounce it wrong. But there's a question saying to Leslie, have you looked at CPTED design guidelines and the implicit biases they perpetuate? They're broadly used in North American cities. Do you know of a better alternative standard that could serve to make public spaces safer for everyone?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So the CPTED refers to crime prevention through environmental design, which was a school of thought going back to the 70s with Oscar Newman, who had this idea of creating kind of like defensible space. And I think it's, been taken up. I think it's gone in and out of favor over time as these ideas do. I'm not an expert in it, but I do agree that there's a lot of limitations. Like, I like to think that if there was a way to just design out fear and crime and danger, like, we would have done it, right? If it was just a design problem, then we would have solved it by now. But of course, it's so much more complex than that. So, I honestly don't think that there could be a set of kind of universal standard design guidelines that, quote unquote, prevent crime, because even, better lighting, better sightlines, these things only go so far. And it maintains this focus, I would call it an over focus on crime in the public sphere, crime in public space, when for most people, especially women and children, the vast majority of violence that we experience is in the private sphere, right? Is in the home. So how are you going to make the home? How are you going to design the home to eliminate domestic violence, right? Or violence against children, or sexual violence, right? So if we're always thinking about, like, what do we do in the public sphere? How do we build this, build that? Missing really the vast majority of violence and harm that does happen in the world. And, in order to address that, what we probably need more than design, and definitely more than, policing and criminalization, is like a radical transformation of society and how we relate to one another. In the shorter term, I would say, if you really care about something like violence against women or women's safety, well, expand affordable housing, expand childcare, give a universal basic income, like do these basic things that support women from to leave violent relationships when they can, and so on, rather than worrying about, where the streetlights are.
I would say also, just to kind of add on to that answer, I think about the link between preemptive kind of architecture, or architecture that attempts to preempt crime, and preemptive policing, right? Like, there are whole sections in the UK where populations are literally under siege. Like, they leave the house and they get harassed by, I'm talking specifically about Black men, they leave the house, they get harassed by police officers who already know their names, right? Police officers who are ready and willing smallest infraction, so as to begin their life like in the system, or begin their life as a person who has been criminalized. And I think that what preemptive architecture does is make it easier for the state then to makes it easier for the state to find those people that it wants to criminalize, and to ensure that their lives end at the point of the state, end in a jail cell, end with continued harassment from the police. And so in following what Leslie said, that really has to be unpicked. We have to, I think, create architectural space that allows us to hide, in the meantime, that allows us really to not be surveilled, allows us to not be seen, with lots of kind of nooks and crannies for people to be able to do, things that are heavily stigmatized, criminalized, whatever, in peace, without that fear of harassment and violence.
Yeah, I think those are both two really helpful. Also, if anyone wants to kind of learn more, I guess, about that kind of harassment in the UK, there's a really good chapter by Luc de Noronha in Deporting Back Britons, about a character called Ricardo, and I would just really recommend that. We've got some more questions in the chat, so I'm going to move over to them. Someone's asked, could you reflect on the meaning of such cross-disciplinary conversations to our understandings of the city and the feminist city in particular? I can repeat that if needed. I don't know who wants to go first.
Yeah, I can try. I think for me, yeah, it's really important, actually. I think that architects meet with, I don't know what I would say I am, a cultural studies person, and gender, like scholars of gender, of, you know, political science. I think it's really important to have an interdisciplinary approach, mainly because of the simple reason that because of the way that disciplines are structured, there is so much purposefully left out of each discipline that you know, it is purported to be good by another one. And I feel like when we break down the barriers between disciplines, we're able to share skills and resources, information, knowledge across these arbitrary boundaries that makes our work within any given field richer and more generative. This idea of staying firm within the School of Architecture or English literature or history, whatever, that's not the way the world is organized. And that's definitely not the way architectural space is organized, right? We all have our own kind of relationships to space, but they all clash and collide. And for some people, it's about the history of land. For others, it's about how certain spaces evoke in them feelings of freedom or memory or whatever. And those all require a kind of, I hate the word, like a diverse skill set in order to deal with the complexity of the lives that we're trying to structure or give meaning to.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, I didn't start out my academic career as a geographer. I came to geography kind of accidentally or incidentally from, you know, from women's and gender studies, and then from an interest in cities. But I do appreciate that geography, human geography, is quite interdisciplinary in its approaches to things. It's not very like gatekeepy about like what methods you use or the kinds of things that you look at. So I found it to be you know, a fairly open space for doing this kind of work. But yeah, I mean, I think even like thinking about the research that I did for Feminist City, I mean, there's citations from, you know, a dozen disciplines, I'm sure, or more in there, because there's so many, yeah, different perspectives and different things that can be said from different points of view. Yeah.
Thanks so much. We'll probably do one more question. Also, just to say from that as well, I completely agree with what you both said. I mean, I did an English undergrad and now I'm somehow doing architecture. So I really understand that. We've got one last question. So Ellie has said, Leslie, you say in your book, public and design interventions rarely address private violence. So how do you both think design interventions could address private violence in this pandemic? Especially considering, as you both say, that home is not a safe place for so many women. We've had to spend so much more time in our homes. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely a tough question. I would say in a broader sense, we need to be thinking, as I said earlier, about kind of really exploding the idea of the single family home and the nuclear family as the kind of building block of the city and of society, and be creating a lot of other kind of opportunities for ways of living with one another, a lot of different choices, because right now we're kind of so locked in both spatially and socially, institutionally, everything into, you know, one kind of primary way of living as a household that both doesn't recognize the wide variety of households and relationships that already exist, but also kind of like funnels us to something that is, you know, supposedly natural, but is actually quite dangerous and exploitative for so many people, or simply just not what people want, but we have so few alternatives. So can we think about, you know, co-housing? Can we think about intergenerational living? Can we think about, you know, the kinds of communal and shared spaces that can be built into both our cities and neighborhoods and into our housing arrangements, like there are other ways of doing things. People have been talking about them for centuries, and these designs exist and can be kind of reinvigorated. So to me, that would be a starting point. Like, let's open up the world of housing to ensure that we're not kind of stuck with so few choices about where to live and who to live with.
Yeah, I think just kind of echoing that and following on from that point, if we begin to think about design kind of expansively, then the demand for kind of free social housing is in demand. It's a design intervention we can make, and so is, you know, the abolition of the new family. That's a, you know, design intervention, as is the funding of domestic violence services, right? I think it's incredibly ironic that we're seeing in the UK, you know, the government was like, oh, women who are experiencing domestic violence can leave their homes if they wish, but they spent 10 years completely decimating any access to violence provision in this. Question then came, well, where would these women go, right? That if they flee violence, where you know, is a safe place for them to go? Where is a place of healing? Where is a place of like comprehensive mental health support, etc. And I feel like once we really begin to understand how those are connected to the structure of a building, or, you know, the integrity of a building, or the integrity of a landscape, then we can understand how those demands are also architectural demands. They're also design demands. Instead of individualizing this idea like, in this way, you know, women in order to get out. That's, I think, a neoliberal response that tells us that there can only be individual solution. What we need really is, as we said before, the total transformation of the world we live in. And in the meantime, the strategic making of these architectural interventions and demands of the state, of institutions, in order to redistribute those resources to the people who need them most.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that from both of you. That was such a kind of insightful way to end. This will kind of have to be that will have to have been our last question. I know we've just had quite a few more questions coming in, and I'm really sorry to those who didn't get a chance to have their questions answered. Oh, I've just been spotlighted. But I don't know if kind of Lola and Leslie are comfortable to have questions asked afterwards at another point. But for those who didn't get a chance, I'm really sorry. And I hope that everyone has still felt like they had a really kind of insightful discussion. I know that I really found that incredibly generative and useful. And thank you so much, Leslie and Lola, for sharing your time and energy and thoughts with us. I'm going to pass over to Ira to kind of briefly speak about the rest of the Unfold things. I don't know, sorry, I just...
No. Fantastic. I mean, unless you want to say something to conclude, would you like to say a few words to kind of close the conversation? You don't have to.
Lola and Leslie.
Lola and Leslie, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought you were talking to Kitty. Oh, I think actually we've said all that we on, but left to say. I think for me, thank you so much for inviting us to have this conversation with you, and please keep me at least informed in terms of what Decolonise Architecture is doing, like student organizing and stuff.
Of course. Yeah.
Yes, totally agree. Thank you. It's been such a pleasure and such an honor to talk to you all and to engage with Lola and her work today. Thank you.
And I join Kita and all of the people I'm sure who attended this conversation this evening for us. I join Kita and the others in thanking you, Lola and Leslie, for this really thought-provoking conversation. Again, so many points raised in relation to imagining the feminist city and finding it in a way. And we hope that next time we'll be able to host you in person, although this time we had the privilege of this kind of transatlantic conversation, which went very well. I'll just say, please join us 2 weeks from now, same time, to a conversation between Nicolas Simchik Areze and Juan Miguel Gomez Duran from the office Convite in Colombia, who will discuss this very particular practice that is structured as a cooperative with communities in the very exciting, innovative ways of working together with in collaboration with the community. So please join us then. I think it very much relates to the things that you've discussed today on how we kind of work together to create the city. And again, thank you so much, Leslie and Lola, for this great conversation. And yes, we wish you all a great evening and an afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Such an honor to be a listener.